Hello, I'm Stephanie Beloris, your host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, I'm joined by Vice President and Research Director Amy DeMartine and Principal Analyst Ali Mellon to discuss the lessons learned from the recent CrowdStrike outage. Welcome both.
Thanks so much for having us.
Excited to be here.
Great. So let's dig into it. Obviously, the outage brought a ton of issues to light. Perhaps the biggest was the importance of a resilience plan. So, Amy, I'm going to start off with you because you're the lead on all things business continuity and business resilience. What were some of the aspects that this issue really highlighted?
Well, for me, I think the biggest thing it highlighted is that all our playbooks and run books that we've built on loss scenarios like, oh, we've lost an entire data center, none of that applied in this case. So all of those loss scenarios, plannings that we did, they almost need to be thrown out. And even the playbooks and the run books themselves. While it's good to build those muscle memories to deal with an actual incident, you now need to focus on something a little different. And that is, first, you need to know what are your critical services. What are you delivering to customers? And then you need to have a map back all the way down to the servers, the databases, so that when you have an outage of specific things, in this case, Microsoft devices, what do those then affect for your customers? And you can work your way back to what services are impacted, and then also come up with a prioritized list of what services should be brought up in what order and how to do that. The playbooks and run books of the past give very, we're going to bring up this and then we're going to bring up this, but it usually has no knowledge of who those customers are or why they're important, how they're impacted, what the revenue is to the business. None of that information is passed on. Of course, this then brings up the tricky problem of a CMDB.
And for those who aren't steeped in the day-to-day of IT infrastructure and operations, let's define the CMDB.
Well, the CMDB was always supposed to be a database of your assets, your configuration management of your entire digital footprint. It was supposed to keep all of those associations in one spot. So you could go from services all the way down to their digital components. It's always been out of date. It's always been incomplete. And so at this point, there is some help in terms of AI ops. And you are able to then, an AI ops will actually show you a map of what customers are actually executing. So that's great. It also may be incomplete, but that plus the CMDB is your best bet to try to keep it up to date and complete.
And it's funny because security probably maintains their equivalent of the CMDB all by themselves, a completely separate one that has different results. So there's a lot of difficulty there.
Yeah, and then your BC planning tools are sort of trying to do the same thing as well, which is they're using surveys and questionnaires to try to do some sort of dependency mapping from, a customer-facing service all the way back to IT assets. So it seems like we're all collecting this information in a whole bunch of silos and none of it's complete.
And none of it goes back to the root problem of if this server goes down, who's impacted? The other problem, of course, with this was individual employees' machines were down. So who do you bring up first? Who do you make a call to say, okay, these are the manual steps you have to execute? Do you have communications beyond their primary work device? Are you able to contact them? And so all of those things, this really highlighted that most companies don't have. They don't have the ability to contact their employees and know in what order to contact them in.
Right. It is interesting when you mentioned like identifying critical customer services. I mean, that's a lot of what DORA demands now.
Indeed. So DORA, Bank of England, Hong Kong, Australia, all the operational resilience regulations demand that you first define your critical, sometimes they call them important services. And you have to understand those so that when you start bringing things up, they are the front and center in all of your recovery procedures is how do I bring up my customers? How do I make sure that they are not impacted as much as you possibly can?
Right. And in the CrowdStrike scenario, I mean, your backups were no help. Failing over to another data center wasn't any help because you'd have the same issue over there. The update had been propagated everywhere. And it required manual recovery, like hands-on keys, in order to stop the boot loop that was happening to Microsoft Windows-based devices. So I'm curious, in this scenario, like your typical technology resilience wouldn't have helped.
No, and I think it really is a call to, we've got to let go of this idea of resilience by recovery. It can't be that anymore. We have to have this data at our fingertips of, okay, what are our services? How are they mapped? And then how do we recover based on that? Rather than the traditional way of looking at it, which is sort of flipped. How do I recover my IT? And then customers will get brought up eventually as a consequence.
Okay. So let's switch a little bit here and talk about the impact to security. So for your security administrators out there, what were some of the lessons?
The most important thing moving forward is to get visibility into how and when security vendors and, frankly, any tools operate in the kernel. Most endpoint security tools, especially if we're looking at like EDR and XDR, operate in both userland and kernel mode, and they typically try to minimize what needs to happen in kernel mode as much as they possibly can to reduce any risk of an incident like this. But operating in the kernel is really important. It's important for performance reasons and to ensure that any attacker activity can't bypass the security software. As part of the visibility angle of this, it's really, really critical for security teams to scrutinize what's being sent and evaluated when it's in the kernel. See, the thing is, CrowdStrike had versioning and ring deployments for its sensor updates, which is what most security teams were most concerned about. What they didn't have versioning or ring deployments for is the configuration updates, which still had kernel interaction and posed a risk if untested or if tested incorrectly. So making sure that your team is aware of every update that is input into the kernel, how those updates are tested, how they are deployed, and having control over that entire process is critical moving forward. That goes for all endpoint security vendors, by the way, not just CrowdStrike. But especially if we're looking at, like, take an example of the retail sector, you may not want to push out these updates on Black Friday because you may want to maintain a little bit control, or maybe you do, but only in regions that you don't have as much of a important day of the activities happening. And this is different days for every industry, but making sure that you have that control so that you can ensure resiliency, so that you can ensure uptime is very, very important moving forward.
Yeah. Although the interesting thing is that there does seem to be a tension in there because these updates, whether it's like a content or configuration update or an update to the actual endpoint agent, a lot of times we're told like these updates need to go out as quickly as possible because they're designed to detect against some new threat. And if you don't, then you'll be accused of, again, not being up to date and not having the latest and greatest systems that were designed to protect against this new threat or this new malware that was out there.
There's definitely a tension in this. Do you want to delay these updates by weeks? Absolutely not. Do you want to delay it by a few hours to see what happens when the rest of the world rolls it out? Potentially. There's a balance to be had. Ideally, you'll be updating along with the rest of the world as these updates become available. But in some cases, you have to prioritize the business need more than the security need. In addition, these updates aren't always about detection and improving detection quality or outputting something that is going to detect a threat that's happening right that second. In some cases, it's just to gather additional context off the endpoint. It's more of a just normal development, part of the development process. Like in this case with this update, this was just to collect more information off the endpoint. And so keeping in mind that not every single type of update like this, especially when it's a configuration update versus a content update, there's a trade-off there too.
Okay. I guess one more consideration here is I think about most security teams and most IT teams being stretched thin. So let's actually just focus on security. If you look at the typical like large enterprise, they're going to have 50 plus security controls in their environment. So the ability to focus on all of them to this level of depth where they can really interrogate the updates, that also just seems like a ton of overhead that security teams might not be prepared for.
So it depends, right? Sure, we have upwards of likely over 50 products. Security teams are way over capacity when it comes to the security tools that they're using. Most of those are not operating in the kernel. So this is an issue for a very select few, typically the endpoint security products, because they just need that access. So it's a much smaller list than you might think on first blush. However, you're right in that that's not something that you want to have to be scrutinizing on a regular basis. And now, in fact, as a part of this, one of the things that's really important beyond getting the visibility into how these security vendors are issuing these updates is making sure that they're doing it in the most appropriate way possible and that they are doing ring deployments, that they are doing significant testing of these updates. Having control over when the updates publish is something that's going to be helpful for teams that are severely concerned, especially in very specific scenarios, about business continuity and want to make sure that they're covered, even if the vendor has gone through all the steps, or maybe there's something that was missed during that process. But in reality, that's more of a worst case scenario. It should not be the regular state of business affairs for you to go in and do these updates and to prioritize these updates.
One interesting thing when we were talking to clients, like immediately after the outage, I think it was a day or two after the outage, after they had a chance to recover and think back on it, they laid most of the blame on CrowdStrike. I'd say they probably put 80% of the blame on CrowdStrike, but they reserved a good 20%, maybe even a little bit more, on Microsoft itself and their frustration with the Windows operating system, which is, how could a modern OS not have recovered from this content update? Like, how could a modern OS have gotten stuck in this bizarre boot loop, and the only way to get out of it was with a manual update? So, and I've heard some clients say, well, maybe we need to look at other operating systems for certain parts of the environment. So I'm curious what steps we've seen Microsoft take as a result of this.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I've heard a lot of those concerns as well from clients and from others in the industry. I mean, on the one hand, to be honest, any software engineer knows that at a certain point, there's only so much you can do from an operating system standpoint to protect the kernel if you want to give third-party applications access to the kernel. If you want to revoke that access or keep it to a bare minimum, then it's a different conversation, which is what we see with Apple and in some cases of Linux. But if you want to provide the not only flexibility, but also backwards compatibility that Microsoft has for kernel access, it's very difficult for them to move everything, all of the applications that are currently operating in the kernel from third-party standpoint, out of the kernel. So that's the first thing. Is as challenging as this was specifically for Windows machines, there are some elements of that are just a reality of the way that the software is designed and built. But in order to address this, Microsoft recently hosted its Windows Endpoint Security Ecosystem Summit, which was meant to bring together industry leaders to talk about what's going to come next for endpoint security applications leveraging kernel mode. And one of the takeaways from that summit is that Windows is going to prioritize hooks into the kernel that are available in user mode so that less capability has to be deployed in kernel mode. So that can help reduce some of this risk. But it is a very difficult balance for Microsoft because of the backwards compatibility challenges and because ultimately they have an endpoint security product in Microsoft Defender that also operates in kernel mode. So they really need to be careful to balance what access they're providing to kernel mode and what access they're providing their teams to kernel mode so that they can avoid any antitrust issues moving forward as they attempt to transition some of these security vendors out of the kernel as much as possible.
Yeah. So Amy, it's good to hear that they're taking some of those steps and reducing some risk. Amy, but there's still a concentration risk here in this scenario, which is one, how dependent organizations are on Microsoft and the Windows operating system. So yeah, why not try to address that concentration risk? And then also the fact that I think by some estimates, CrowdStrike has over 20% of endpoint security / XDR kind of market. So there was also this concentration risk of the pure fact that so many organizations had the combination of both of them. So I don't know, what's your thoughts from a concentration risk perspective?
Well, I think first of all, organizations have no idea what their concentration risk
Yeah.
is and are not thinking about OS concentration risk. They're not thinking about that data centers are normally populated with Windows machine and that the OS might actually be their concentration risk. They might be thinking, oh, well, we've got data centers in certain locations and that might be their concentration risk. Or maybe they are concentrated with a certain cloud vendor. But they're certainly not thinking about OS level. I think this was a real wake up call to, oh, well, yeah, there are other OSs that maybe we should be thinking about and that we should be spread out to. But at the same time, it comes down to, okay, what do we prefer? And as you look at teams who are spread thin, IT is also spread thin. How do you manage a data center if you're doing it yourself with multiple OSs? I mean, that was the whole reason why we went back to, well, let's try to figure out how we can make this all one OS or not, to try to eliminate the variables, eliminate the variation. So I think on one hand, we do have to think about concentration risk in terms of vendors who we're using, but then also and understand how that risk plays out. Are we accepting that risk? Is there something we can do to mitigate it? But then also, okay, even if we have this concentration risk, maybe we accept it because of the benefits it gives us in terms of eliminating variability that would cause us other kinds of headaches as we start to roll out configuration changes or patches. All of those come with risk too.
And I'll also just highlight here that as many customers as obviously this showcase CrowdStrike has, if you look at some of the data around this, it affected less than 1% of Windows machines. So Microsoft has a massive footprint here that way outpaces anything that we've seen from any endpoint security vendor besides Microsoft, obviously. And so the concentration risk question, I'm always curious about this because it's like, on the one hand, yes, a lot of systems went down because of this, but on the other, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what Microsoft actually has from a software standpoint. And also, I worry, just as Amy was saying, about the operational difficulties that would come with, say, trying to run multiple endpoint agents at the same time in order to make sure that if one causes this, another doesn't. And I just don't see logistically how this would end up being more effective than trying to address this at the root cause of the issue, which comes back to the testing that's involved, the resiliency, and not doing resiliency by recovery, which is a term that I love and think is so cool.
But speaking of risk, so depending on the industry that you're in, I mean, you mentioned it was just 1% of all Windows machines that are deployed globally. But when you look at the industries that were the most impacted, airlines were down. And there were several airlines that were down for days. Healthcare was down. You know, it affected medical care. So if you're in a critical infrastructure industry or an industry that's less tolerant of downtime, I mean, I could see the argument there that maybe you want to really avoid concentration risk. Maybe there's a strategy where your enterprise systems are one OS and then your true like user endpoints are another OS. But I at least think these are the kinds of questions that maybe IT leaders and CISOs need to start asking themselves. And to your point, Amy, I don't think they've ever asked themselves those questions. So time to start asking some existential questions to ourselves. So what's next for CISOs? Speaking of CISOs.
Well, this podcast is actually really good timing because we are just coming off the heels of Falcon, which is CrowdStrike's yearly user conference. And from what we hear from their customers, there are a couple of things to consider. First, one of the things that we've stated in a number of blogs and reports we've done on this outage is that most of the customers we talk to have no intention of moving off of CrowdStrike as a result of this event. This definitely eroded a lot of trust with their customer base, but customers are surprisingly willing to forgive this time, in part because they view CrowdStrike as having saved them through a lot of different security incidents over the years. If you fall into that bucket, it's likely that regardless, you're still going to run into pressure at the board level or C-level to rip and replace CrowdStrike. And preparing for that conversation now and making either the justification to stay or the plan to move off of it as bulletproof as you can is really important. Now, if you opt to stay with CrowdStrike, we see many leaders that are leveraging this moment to get significant discounts to be made whole post-incident. We also see many competitors opting to offer significant discounts to get customers to convert. So it's a good time to be an EDR customer, oddly enough, after this. However, do keep in mind that the vast majority of endpoint security vendors operate in both kernel and user mode, which we said before. And so you won't necessarily avoid this issue just because you opt to move away from CrowdStrike or say deploy CrowdStrike to certain endpoints, but not others. The other thing that's really worth noting is that a surprise guest at CrowdStrike's event this year was Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella, who video conferenced into George Kurtz's keynote to talk about how they were partnering on recovering from and ensuring an incident like this does not happen again. To me, this signals a continuation of at least their public commitment to trying to improve resiliency of the systems, and especially given it came right after Microsoft hosted its Windows Endpoint Security Ecosystem Summit, shows that this is a priority for both companies, which I do take as a positive.
Well, it's good. Actually, speaking of good timing as well, we've got our own Forrester Security and Risk Summit coming up in December. Amy, you're actually the co-host for the event. Any sessions that you would point out, which would be good for folks to zero in on if they want to learn more about some of the changes coming up in software?
Yeah, I think the biggest session to attend is Janet Worthington's main stage. She's going to be talking about the software supply chain. So when we look back, CrowdStrike is not the only software that has had loss or has caused breaches. When we look back, I mean, does anybody remember MoveIt? That software caused major havoc for all kinds of industries across the world. And so we need to reframe our thinking about what software is and think of it as a supply chain. Who are we getting it from? That software is usually built on other software. So you really have to start thinking of it as your first party software, your second party software, all the way to your nth party, and start looking at, okay, what kinds of software are we bringing in and what kind of risk comes with it? There is also, of course, all the tools, software tools, the applications, of course, we run, but then the tools that support the applications, those are also a software supply chain. So Janet Worthington's session is a must see.
Okay. You know what else is interesting? Just to go back to the AI ops conversation. This is AI for IT operations. I mean, there's tremendous excitement about the potential for AI ops to kind of combine predictive analytics together with generative AI to, again, help predict maintenance issues, predict downtime, identify patterns within our IT operating environment. And there's all kinds of like ops where AI ops can be applied to, core IT ops, IT resilience, DevOps. I mean, one thought was actually around security ops. I mean, Ali, I'm curious, like, what can we expect from AI and for security?
Yeah.
Not securing AI for security.
Yeah, I'm really excited, to be honest, because I feel like we spent the past 2 years being very excited for what have been disappointing features when it comes to generative AI and security tools, quite frankly. But I think we're turning that corner and we're starting to see some real innovation coming out of vendors on what they can do and how it will actually be helpful for security practitioners. So I'm really excited to be hosting a workshop at Security and Risk Summit on generative AI uses in security at the event. And then we actually have a series of talks on generative AI and security. And we have so much content that we're offering a certification for attendees on security and generative AI. So if you do come, please come to the workshop, get the certification, learn a lot about generative AI and what it means for security. And of course, I'll be on site and happy to take one-on-ones about generative AI or the outage.
Okay. Well, fantastic. Well, that sounds like a great place to end our chat today. I just want to thank you both. Thank you, Ali, and thank you, Amy.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Forrester's What It Means podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. To continue the conversation, follow Forrester on LinkedIn or drop us a note at podcast@forrester.com. Thanks for listening.